Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, depending on which time zone you've just dialed in from. I'm Selena Namchilo. I'm a consulting editor for The Lancet. On behalf of The Lancet, I'm delighted to welcome you to the global launch of the new Lancet series on commercial determinants of health. I'll be your main moderator today with the help of Professor Rob Moody from the University of Melbourne, who led this series. I speak to you from Melbourne, Australia, and where I am, it is the land of the Wurundjeri First Nations people of the Kulin Nation. As is our custom, I pay my respect to the traditional custodians of the land, to their elders past and present. I also pay my respect to any First Nations peoples on this webinar, recognising their special role in caring for land, waters and health of all species. So thank you so much for giving your time and interest in trust to us for the next 75 minutes. Today, you're going to hear from the editor-in-chief of The Lancet, Richard Horton, the lead authors of the series, and expert commentators from civil society and business consortiums. But before I introduce you to our excellent speakers, I do have some less exciting housekeeping to do. First, all of you are welcome to submit your questions throughout the presentation on the Ask Question box on the dashboard. Secondly, you'll see in the dashboard the related resources. There you'll find all of the series papers, the commentaries, and also some excellent policy briefs prepared by one of the main sponsors of this series, the Victorian Health Promotion Foundation of Australia. You can adjust the screen to suit yourself. And finally, this is all going to be recorded and you'll get it sent in your email. So the speakers today are Richard Horton, Editor-in-Chief of The Lancet, Rob Moody from the University of Melbourne, who led the series, and then the three paper series leads, that was Anna Gilmore from the University of Bath, paper 1, Jen Lacey-Nichols from the University of Melbourne, paper 2, and Professor Sharon Friel from the Australian National University, paper 3. And then we're going to hear from Paula Johns from Act Health Brazil. Thanks so much for calling in. And also Lucy Mugai from B-Lab Africa. So delighted to have you here. We would like to acknowledge all of these sponsors and contributors to this webinar. And in particular, I would like to thank the sponsors of the series, which include the universities mentioned here, Spectrum, and the main sponsor, Vic Health. So this is our agenda. I won't go through it in detail, but primarily we're going to be looking at what are the commercial determinants, conceptualizing commercial entities, the solutions, which you'll be waiting for, and then hear from civil society and also from business. And then we'll have a Q&A. So without further ado, I'm absolutely delighted from here in Melbourne to welcome Richard, who's calling in from London. Over to you, Richard.
Thanks so much, Selena, and what a pleasure it is to be here with you today. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Let me immediately extend my huge thanks to the authors of this tremendous series. Let me just try and very briefly set some context. As we all know, the history of global health over the last few decades has been one of advances, but also retreats. Let me give you one specific instance to try and illustrate what I mean: maternal and child health. During the era of the Millennium Development Goals, we saw enormous progress. We built up a formidable evidence base of the interventions that can work to reduce maternal and child mortality. We managed to garner widespread international political commitment, both in the United Nations and with presidents and prime ministers. We strengthened accountability mechanisms, holding people with political power accountable for their promises and commitments, and we unleashed billions, tens of billions of extra dollars for women's and children's health, so that we really could, by 2015, look to how we could end preventable mortality among women and children in a generation. But since the beginning of the Sustainable Development Goal era, we've had a regression. Under 5 mortality and maternal mortality, they are stagnating. The numbers recently released by UNICEF and WHO show that we're not making the progress that we used to make. Why? Why is that? Partly it's the pandemic, partly it's because we're seeing the impact of the climate crisis and environmental degradation, partly it's conflict around the world that's limiting our progress. But a particularly important reason for why we're not making the progress that we once made on women's and children's health is because of the predatory commercial practices that shape the behaviors, the choices, the life chances of women and children. Now, we tried to set some of these predatory commercial practices out in a commission we published in February 2020 on the future of child health and on a series of papers on breastfeeding earlier this year. But with this series, for the very first time, we have a world-class team of authors that takes on the commercial determinants of health fully and directly and gives the proper prominence to this issue that is of growing enormous importance. This series is the most solely analysis and deconstruction of the damaging and pervasive influence of the commercial determinants that you will have read to date. In global health today, you will hear frequent appeals and calls to embrace and to include the private sector as an essential partner in our work. This series that you're about to learn about does not seek to incite a bloody revolution, but it does provide the evidence to enable you to question some of the most troubling and disturbing assumptions that are holding back progress in global health today. So let's go. Back to Selena.
Thank you so much, Richard. I'm now going to hand over to Rob to explain why now. And I hope that you'll stay with us throughout the course of this webinar, all 2,837 of you who have registered throughout the world.
Thanks very much.
Over to you, Rob.
Yeah, thanks very much, Selena. And let's take you back to 1991. So this is the rainbow model of the social determinants of health presented by Dahlgren and Whitehead. It's become the most widely used model of its kind because it really shows the conditions in which we are born, we grow, we work, we live, we age, and the wider set of forces and systems shaping the conditions of our daily lives. But the world has changed markedly since 1991. So let's look at why is it that we should now really focus on the commercial determinants of health. There's many reasons. The escalating evidence of the escalating harm to people and the planet from an increasingly market-driven world. The rapid growth in size, power, and influence of corporations, particularly as we'll see in the relation to nation states. The great difficulty that many governments have in managing this size and this power and this influence and the leverage. But also the need for us as researchers and practitioners to align across a whole range of different industries and different sectors. And as we'll show you today, the need to define, conceptualize, and understand these commercial determinants of health, the need to disaggregate the vast array of and diversity of commercial entities, and very importantly, the need for real alternatives, whether they're higher business standards for stronger governments, stronger civil society responses, much healthier practices and products. We know that commercial actors can contribute positively to health and society, and many do, providing essential products and services, whether, for example, here, whether it's crop rotations in conservation agricultural systems, equaling healthy profits and healthy soils in Zambia's eastern province, or just the example of a healthy high street in the UK, or profitable renewable energy products across the globe. But why now? Because of this rapidly escalating size, power, reach, and influence of many of the commercial actors has really resulted in negative impacts on health and on equity. The climate crisis and the non-communicable disease epidemics are but two examples. And as we say here, the industries that produce just 4 harmful products, tobacco, alcohol, ultra-processed foods and beverages, and fossil fuels cause at least 1/3 of the preventable deaths per year globally. In this increasingly market-driven world, there's an unsustainable push for sales and expansion that has really tipped the balance, as Anna will show, in favour of commercial profits over people and planet. Why now? Of the world's largest 100 economies in 2016, 71 were corporations. This has increased from 2000, when it was 51 of the world's largest economies were corporations. And if we look at this, then Walmart makes more money than Spain or the Netherlands or Australia. ExxonMobil has created greater revenues than the governments of Mexico or Belgium or Switzerland. So this is where power really lies. Why now? Because of the limited and highly variable ability of governments and civil societies to control or effectively respond to this power and to these harms, whether national and international policies are being eroded and influenced by this power, influence and leverage. And a recent study found that very recent studies found that 6 of the 7 national NCD policies with the lowest implementation in both 2019 and 2021 were all related to the restrictions around unhealthy commodities, including tobacco, alcohol, and ultra-processed foods and beverages. Why now? As research in this area has substantially increased over the last 20 years, there's a real need to bring researchers that work in different issues, whether it's tobacco or alcohol or gambling or fossil fuels, very much together. But it's not only the researchers. We need to ensure that economists, lawyers, policy leaders, civil society leaders, business leaders, public health practitioners and regulators have a consensus definition and a common conceptual understanding of what the commercial determinants are and the impact that they are really having. Here, just on this slide, for example, we see the rapid growth and development of the terms used to describe this perspective over the last 15 years. The increased interest in commercial determinants of health really does coincide with this overwhelming growth, consolidation and power of corporations across the globe. And lastly, why now? Commercial actors must hold themselves and be held to much higher standards. We need stronger, better informed governments, stronger civil society responses, and much healthier practices and products. And as we put to you, the question is not whether the world has the resources or the will to take such actions, but whether or not humanity can survive if we fail to make this effort. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rob. So we will now hear from each of the 3 paper series leads. And the first series paper is, what are the commercial determinants of health? Over to you, Anna.
Really got to understand this issue in its complexity to ensure that we take the right actions. And so this paper really had 2 primary purposes: to define and then to conceptualize the commercial determinants of health. And this is the definition that we propose. Let me just highlight a few things about this definition. First, you can see here that it's neutral. It doesn't specify either positive or negative impacts on health. And that's primarily because commercial actors are incredibly diverse, and therefore their impacts are, of course, incredibly varied. While some, particularly the largest transnational corporations that Rob was highlighting, do cause significant harm, many others play essential roles in health and society, and they will also be a key part of the solution. So secondly, we focus on 2 key outcomes of interest: health and equity. And health we define broadly as both human and planetary health, which of course are closely interconnected and driven by the same issues. And equity really has been overlooked to some extent in the work so far on the commercial determinants of health. But it's highlighted because the commercial sector, which includes of course the financial sector, plays a significant role in driving social and health inequities. And this is just one example, that over recent years, the pay gap between chief executive salaries, which have increased exponentially, and worker salaries has really grown massively to what this describes as obscene levels. So lastly, we highlight these words, systems, practices, and pathways. And that's really to signal that the complexity of the issues involved here. The idea that the commercial determinants of health is just about a few industries selling harmful products for profit is really way too simplistic. It involves systems and practices and pathways, as I'll try and highlight. So having come up with that definition, we then had the unenviable task of trying to produce a model to illustrate it. So this is our attempt to do that. And you can see that there are three key elements: that the commercial sector at the top, the determinants of health sub-model, if you like, at the bottom. And then in between those, that the black arrows highlight the system nature of the problem and the underlying drivers. So let me try and talk you through each of those elements. So first of all, the commercial sector. So what we've tried to do here is in the center, we've tried to disentangle and categorize the key practices that commercial entities engage in, and that can influence health. And this means that corporations, they don't just influence health through the products they produce or the services they provide. They can also influence health through these practices, and again, both negatively or positively. And we highlight to the left and the right that these practices range from ethical or legal on one side to unethical or illegal on the other side. So, for example, financial practices might vary from full payment of taxes to tax avoidance, which is legal but unethical, to tax evasion, such as involvement in tobacco smuggling, which is illegal. And Tax Justice Network has recently estimated that multinational corporations are shifting 40% of all profits made abroad into tax havens. And of course, that impacts indirectly on health because it limits the resources that countries have to fund healthcare, for example. Let's take another example, labour and employment practices. Those can range from safe work environments with fair wages to unsafe and exploitative work environments, including, for example, child labour. And then the white circle around the blue here is to illustrate that the extent to which commercial entities engage in those practices and the ways in which they use their practices depend on their growth strategies and their business models, and the extent to which profit is a primary driver. And so perhaps unsurprisingly, the most egregious evidence really relates to the largest transnational and multinational corporations. So the second element of the model is this determinants of health model. And what we attempt to do here is show how those practices impact on different levels of the model. So you'll recognize that this draws directly on the Dahlgren and Whitehead model that Rob has shown. And it primarily does that to show that health and equity in the center are impacted by a number of increasingly structural factors as we move towards the outside that extend way beyond an individual's control. And whilst many of the same key elements are in this as are in the Dahlgren and Whitehead model, because of course they are the factors that influence health, what we've attempted to do is specifically highlight particular factors that the commercial sector can influence and through which they impact on health. So let me just give you one example, and that's how commercial actors use their political practices to influence policy. So we all know that commercial actors attempt to influence diverse policies, whether it's trade or tax or labour. But let's focus for a minute on these public health policies that Rob highlighted. We know many of the policies that are needed to tackle non-communicable diseases. They were outlined in this WHO report over 5 years ago now, yet many governments are struggling to implement those policies. And the evidence shows that many corporations across different industry sectors are using their political practices to consistently oppose these best buy policies. And that's a key reason for this lack of implementation. But what is less well known is that corporations also use their political practices to influence what we call in our model in level 2 upstream policies. And these are policies that really set the rules on how the downstream policies are made. And here the evidence shows that diverse corporations have also used their political practices to establish rules on policy making which advantage their interests. And a number of different corporations worked together to do this, and they did so deliberately to make it harder to pass public health and environmental policies. And the evidence suggests that these rules really work in exactly the way that they intended. And in fact, some have even labelled these systems a threat to democracy because they bring policy making under unprecedented levels of corporate control. But then moving up to level 1, the evidence is that major corporations, along with the very wealthy, have also played a key role in influencing political and economic systems. In fact, they've played a key role in promoting and embedding neoliberalism. And they've done this in a variety of ways, funding networks of neoliberal think tanks that work internationally and locally, establishing university business schools, and working through powerful organizations such as the World Economic Forum. And this is important because it's this change in the way that capitalism is organized, specifically the move away from a more regulated form of capitalism in the post-war period to this far less regulated form of capitalism, this free market capitalism that we know as neoliberalism, that really came to the fore since the late 1970s. And this shift lies at the heart of the commercial determinants of health, and it helps explain why harm from commercial products and practices has been increasing over recent decades. So let me just touch on a few of the issues involved in. I can't possibly touch on all of them. But privatization is a key element of neoliberalism, and that led to the expansion of commercial sector into areas that were previously the function of the state: healthcare, education, housing, water, and so on. So of course that brings these issues that are so important to health under far greater corporate control. And the impacts have in fact been varied, but a key issue is that the evidence suggests that it's restricted access to services that are essential to health, particularly for the least well off. So another element is trade and investment liberalisation. And again, the impacts of this are varied. It has contributed to economic development and employment, but it's also led to the global expansion of the tobacco epidemic, the obesity epidemic, the NCD epidemics. And I think what's particularly interesting about this is that organizations such as the International Monetary Fund, when they were promoting these policies, they didn't distinguish between liberalizing trade in products that are beneficial, perhaps to health, or products that are immensely harmful, such as tobacco. And nor did they require tobacco control policies to be put in place before trade was liberalized or investment was liberalized. And that means that, unnecessary damage was caused. And then another key element is deregulation. And this is particularly important because the norms around regulation, this idea that we need to roll back regulation of corporations, and that's regulation across different spheres. And it also involves reducing taxation on corporations. And this has led to changes that have impacted on health. For example, the decline in labour standards. So that has led to the growth in 0 hours and informal contracts that really came to public attention, in particular during COVID-19, because there was evidence that workers on those contracts had higher rates of disease. So as a result of these changes, not only have corporations become increasingly able to cause harm, but through the reductions in taxation in particular, they've been able to externalize the cost of their harm. And these changes lead to what we've called in the paper a pathological system. And that leads me to this third element of our model, the systems element. And so you can see here through these black arrows that commercial entities have become increasingly able to externalize their costs. And those costs then fall on us, on state and society. But because those commercial entities are not meeting their costs, they become more wealthy, they make greater profits. And so you see this kind of growing disparity between wealth in the private sector and wealth in the public sector. And that leaves these corporations increasingly able to shape norms in their interests and to engage in these practices that I've highlighted, like marketing and lobbying. And of course, that means they are then able to shape this whole system increasingly in their interests. And unless governments start to hold them to account, the whole system becomes unchecked and the problems continue to grow. So this attempts to illustrate in a bit more detail this system problem. So if we start from the left-hand side, the dark blue arrows, those are intending to signal the shift towards ever larger and more powerful transnational actors. They're then able to shape norms, as I've shown you, and policies. And through influencing these policies, they're both able to increase sales and reduce costs. And both of those things can lead to harm, which is the green arrow in the center. So, you know, for example, if the products they're selling are damaging to health, that will increase harm. If they're increasing costs by taking shortcuts on how they treat their staff or how they dispose of their waste, that also leads to harm. And because those costs are externalized, their profits go up. And so they become the winners in this system. But then we have the harm in the middle. As I've said, we're left to meet the costs of that harm, public, individuals, civil society. And of course, that reduces the resources then we and governments have available to pay for healthcare, housing, welfare, and so on. And of course, that then compounds the harm and increases the level of harm. In a way, what the ultimate irony is this, that despite this incredibly complex system problem, many governments are either simply waiting until people get sick and therefore intervening here at level 6 in the model, or they're trying to address these complex problems by focusing on individual behavior change. And this is in large part because corporations have consistently framed these problems as matters of poor individual choice, simply as a way of diverting attention from their role in driving this harm. And obviously, just focusing interventions at this level is not only incredibly expensive, but it's largely ineffective. It's like swimming against the tide. And so really what we need to do is we need far more radical, upstream, equitable and sustainable solutions. And I'll hand over to my co-authors now to explore how we do that.
Thank you so much, Anna. And thank you, so much for all of the work that you've done even before the series started. I'm delighted to hand over now to paper 2 lead author, Jen Lacey-Nichols, also awake here on this side of the world, talking about conceptualizing commercial entities in public health. Over to you, Jen.
Thanks, Selena. And I guess our paper tries to pick up really focusing on one section of the model that Anna introduced. We're really looking in at that question of commercial sector and asking perhaps the deceptively simple question of, well, what do we mean when we talk about the commercial sector? What are we trying to cover off here? And the impetus for this paper comes from 3 observations. And the first is that historically, public health has tended to focus on a relatively narrow segment of the commercial world, tend to focus on manufacturers of harmful commodities, often tobacco, alcohol, and ultra-processed foods. But the commercial world is obviously much larger than that. The second observation is that even though the research and policy focus has been quite narrow, we often speak in loose generalizations. So we'll talk about industry or we'll talk about corporations. And I like to sort of note ironically, well, I'm part of an industry. I'm part of the higher education sector. That's an industry. And I think there's a recognition that we need to note that when we do that, it paints the public health community and public health actors as against the entirety of the business world, when in fact it's particular segments and particular actors that are the key drivers of the harms when we talk about commercial determinants. And the last point is something that Richard touched on in his introduction, where he talked about how we embrace and include the private sector really with no strings attached when we're talking about global health, when we're talking about policymakers. And we've got black and white guidelines when it comes to the tobacco industry with the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control and Conflicts of Interest. And there's just nothing adequate for any other type of commercial actor or sector really out there. And to address the sort of wild, wild west of conflict of interest that exists right now requires a much more nuanced engagement with commercial actors in trying to interrogate how they influence health. So our goal here, with my long preamble, is to be able to make meaningful distinctions between commercial actors based on the nature of their health impacts. So a first step in thinking about the commercial sector is to ask, well, what do we mean when we say commercial actors? And we often think of the private sector as free from state control and often distinct then from the public sector, or what's sometimes called the third sector, voluntary or charitable organizations. But the reality is that many commercial actors have characteristics and qualities that overlap with and intersect with public sector and third sector organizations. State-owned enterprises would be one clear example where you have a public, you have some government control, but you also very much have commercial imperatives. If we're looking at that intersection between the private sector and the third sector, we could think of corporate foundations, we can think of social enterprises, where there's a blurriness between pursuing social good and how the organization is structured, as well as the fact that they're clearly engaging often in many commercial practices. So what we're doing here is casting a wider gaze than perhaps just that pure ideal type of commercial entity within the private sector and looking more widely. The other thing to think about is just how we might think through how commercial entities are diverse. So one element to consider is their portfolio. So as I said, we've looked historically at tobacco, alcohol, ultra-processed foods. We've looked at a range of different harmful commodities. We can talk about fossil fuels, we can talk about weapons, we can talk about gambling, we can talk about all these different actors. But there's lots of other sectors that are part of the commercial world. So we can talk about the privatization of education, as Anna noted, we can talk about healthcare, we can talk about renewable energy, social media. We can think about just about anything, and some of it is probably going to be in the private sector and under commercial control. And often when we're talking about commercial actors, they're not just going to have one product or commodity in their portfolio, they're going to have huge diverse portfolios. That makes things complicated. Another element to consider is the resources that a company might have. We can look at trans and multinational corporations that have huge revenues, often rivaling those of governments, as Rob noted, with a geographic footprint spread all over the world. We can also think of small family-owned businesses that might have one employee operating in a single community. They're both part of the commercial sector, but they're going to have vastly different impacts and capacities to influence health, and they'll do so in different ways. And the last element we consider is thinking about the legal form, so that sort of organizational structure. So we can have publicly traded corporations, we can have private family-owned businesses, we can also have cooperatives, we can have social enterprises, we have the whole not-for-profit sector. Often when we're thinking of our harmful corporations, many of the sort of key allies, if we're thinking of trade associations and some of those peak bodies, they're often legally not-for-profits. Many not-for-profits engage in lots of charitable activities, but many also perhaps use that structure more as a strategy to minimize or avoid paying their taxes. We can also consider the informal sector. So especially if we're looking in low and middle income countries, this is an especially important component for education. If we think of the healthcare and the agricultural sector, many of these actors would be part of the informal sector. Yes, they engage in business and in commerce, but they're not really part of that formal legal economy. So this is sort of a snapshot, hopefully, of just some of the different ways that businesses and commercial actors can be different. So what we try to do in paper 2 is to put together a framework of the different considerations that should be taken into account when we're trying to weigh up the health impacts of a company. So in the middle here, you can see we've got the portfolio, the resources, and the organization of the commercial entity, sort of key attributes. We also included transparency here. So as part of the development of this framework, we engaged with a range of different stakeholders, and transparency was a consistent theme of a quality and attribute that was very necessary to be able to evaluate any of this in the first place. And then around the outside, we have those practices that Anna discussed in the model. And so as noted, businesses can engage in a range of different practices. Some may be health promoting, some may be health harming. And if we're thinking of the whole scope of the company, they may be doing harmful and healthy at the same time, which again, I guess the whole point of this is that it makes things very complicated. So what we do in our papers, we set out a framework of a long list of essentially guiding questions. And these are the questions that we say you must ask if you want to try to articulate and truly understand how a corporation or a company or a not-for-profit or whichever commercial actor you're looking at is influencing health. So you can ask questions about some of those practices. So if we look at the political practices, we can ask if it's trying to undermine or circumvent health policies that are already in place. We could ask about, in terms of their employment practices, what's the nature of its employment contracts or its leave entitlements? Or as Anna noted, what perhaps is that ratio of CEO to average worker pay? We can also ask questions that look more at the particular attributes of the organization. So if we're looking at the portfolio, we can ask what products it has, whether it's in its subsidiaries or its parent companies. We can also ask that question of whether any of these products are recognized risk factors for non-communicable diseases. In terms of the resources, we can ask what its market share is, what its annual revenue is, what its profit margins are, what its annual revenue is. And these questions are especially important for thinking through what's that potential magnitude of impact. There's going to be a great difference between looking at the potential health footprint of a multinational corporation versus a company that's operating only in one community. And similarly, there's going to be, I guess, an intersection between all of these in terms of the products that a company has in its portfolio is going to shape perhaps the flavor of some of those practices. So if we're talking about a tobacco company versus the manufacturers of health products and drugs, some of these are considered essential services, and the question there is less around, how are they promoting these to different communities, but rather more around what are the limitations that might be raised in the affordability and access of this. And this, as Sharon will go into more detail in hers, will have important implications for what we might want to do about this and how we might want to take this on. And similarly, I guess, to that question, the organization question is really asking questions around who owns the entity, how and by whom is it funded? And these start to tease out some questions around potential accountability mechanisms as well, and possible entry points to change those incentive structures. So if we're trying to think through some of the potential applications of this framework, one of the things that we'd flagged was thinking about engagement. And so with engagement, this could be policymakers, this could be investors, this could be NGOs thinking about taking on potential funders. And these are essentially the questions that we would want to ask about any potential company or organization that we could engage with. I'll note that what we have developed here as the framework is conceptual. We have not yet attached metrics to this. We haven't weighted any of these things. If you go through and read the paper, we have lots of detailed comments often about the data deficits around this. Many of these questions are incredibly challenging to answer, which points especially to some of the research and monitoring dimensions for future research. There's just so much that we just don't know. Again, transparency is really crucial here. So those are some of the directions for future research, working with some of the stakeholders, working with potential applications of this, whether it's in a particular region or for a particular stakeholder group, whether it's policymakers or others. That could be a really interesting future direction. Some of the other research directions we'd flagged was noting that much of the evidence really comes from high-income countries. There's just not that much in the low and middle income space. This is a huge issue for capacity building as well. And again, as I noted in the introduction, a lot of our research has focused on a relatively small group of harmful industry, harmful commodities, and looking outside that box and trying to think through what is the impact of the commercial sector on health more widely as another area that's under research. And the last one is monitoring, something that's near and dear to my research heart and to many others I imagine on this call. But thinking through, there are some fantastic programs already in place. So are there opportunities to link those together? Are there opportunities to integrate these? Are there opportunities to perhaps use this as a framework to organize the connections of data? All of these are hopefully interesting and useful opportunities to take this and move this forward. And with that, I will hand over to Sharon, who will talk in a great deal more depth about what we might be able to do about commercial determinants.
Thanks very much, Jen, and over to you, Sharon.
Lovely, thank you, Selena. So you've heard from Anna and Jen about the massive structural challenges that we're facing as humanity, and the point of paper 3 in the series is really to try and focus on pathways forward. And so capitalism is not going anywhere, but it's certainly changing. And the question for us is, what must it look like to ensure good health, good planetary health? And so what we've done in the paper is to offer an alternative, an imagination of what we might be striving towards in society. So imagine that we have human and environmental goals that are social and institutional norms. Imagine that the state is actually empowered to be progressive and to place the public interests first. Imagine that the beast is tamed and market activity does actually serve the public interests and that it's held to account in that regard. And imagine that we have governance models and that the way society manages its affairs is done in a way that privileges public over private interests. Now, you might say that all sounds like motherhood and apple pie, and it is if we think that there's one silver bullet to achieve such a vision. But what we note in the paper is the importance of multi-level governance. There are many governors of the commercial determinants of health at the global level, at the regional, at the national, at the subnational, across lots of different sectors, as we've heard. And extensive evidence shows that a combination of actions by different actors really offers the possibilities, together offers the possibilities for transformative systemic change that we need. So let me take us into some of this. And as paper 1, as Anna has highlighted, we need a major reorientation of the political and the economic systems. That's essential. Fundamentally, this means changing the status quo, which requires challenging power asymmetries. And we've heard from Anna how commercial actors exert their power, shape ideas, advance interests, and set the institutional rules of the game via practices such as marketing, political activity, and so on. But all actors have power, and we can use a range of strategies and instruments to advance human and planetary health interests. And what it requires, what we speak about in the paper, is collectively changing the narrative from that individual responsibility to state and commercial responsibility, to us resetting the rules of the game to prioritise people and the environment over profits, and to reaffirm the social and political rights and norms in the public interest. And so what that means that we have to do is to elevate alternative ideas. Maybe it's a social model of health. Maybe we speak about and embrace sustainable prosperity. Maybe it's about the well-being economy. But it's talking about and embedding these as political possibilities and into the mainstream. And encouragingly, we see that in countries like New Zealand, Scotland, here in Australia, we're adopting well-being economy principles, frameworks and budgets, which potentially have the possibilities of reshaping capitalism as we know it. Of course, in and of itself, it won't do all of that, but it goes some of the way. What we also speak about within the paper is the rethinking or reimagining different structural and sectoral policies. And I don't have time to go through every possibility listed here, but it's the combination of these across different policy domains at different levels that is essential. I will note the global policy landscapes and note the importance of the World Health Organization embracing and advancing this commercial determinants of health agenda. WHO has established a commercial and economic determinants of health unit. There will be a global report on the commercial determinants of health in 2024, and you may have seen that the Director General of WHO wrote a comment to accompany this series. This is very, very important. This is a signal to the multilateral system, which is of course connected through all of the member states, that this agenda is really very important for global health equity. And I will also note within this mix of rethinking structural and sectoral policies, the importance of public health people building our capacity to be at these different policy tables. Economics, finance, industry, policy decisions. The decisions made in those rooms absolutely matter enormously for human and planetary health interests. And currently, those voices are much quieter compared to the commercial interests. In the paper, we also speak about different commercial models and practices. Wouldn't it be fabulous if the commercial sector itself played ball and got its house in order and also followed the actions mandated by regulatory policy? But sadly, we know that that's not currently the dominant case. But there is the growing movement towards sustainable business models that can have social and environmental outcomes, making them higher priorities, as well as shifting the focus from shareholders to stakeholders. And we're going to hear from Lucy about benefit corporations, B Corps. Of course, questions remain whether that's something that's just a small number of privately owned companies, or whether that might be enough to catalyse a shift in the current dominant business model. But of course, 21st century capitalism really is fueled by financial institutions, the banks, the pension funds, the hedge funds, the asset management firms. And so these financial actors are key players and therefore offer all sorts of possibilities in terms of helping to shape the type and the size of investments in different companies of different types and behaviours. So different forms and perspectives around investment is vitally important. But fundamentally, regulatory action is needed on specific industries. So a selection of key actions includes excluding conflicted industries from playing a role in policy formulation, improving transparency through obligatory lobbying registers, about commercial sector reporting, about changing the ways science is funded, and regulating to reduce monopoly concentration across the economy. Please have a look at panel 1 in paper 3, because there are actually a lot of existing actions that can and must be taken in a much more widestream way by government that will curb any of these harms of commercial practices. In the paper, we also really point to the importance of social mobilisation and how social movements have been the backbone of change historically. Health organisations and other civil society organisations, grassroots groups, journalists, academics and citizens all engage to create a body of knowledge and practice that can inform the development of effective strategies to address the commercial determinants of health. And we've seen a number of different very successful strategies. Civil society has created coalitions and alliances, sometimes with unusual bedfellows, unions, trade unions, for example, with public health organisations whose presence can change public thinking about an issue and open doors for action. We saw that with the Framework Convention for Tobacco Control. We also see the importance of advocacy, public health campaigns, which enable opponents of a particular business practice to target a specific corporation or industry, and that mobilise a broad cross-section of partners at multiple levels. This we saw through South Africa's Treatment Action Campaign, which forced global pharmaceutical companies to improve access to antiretroviral medications. And civil society has become incredibly successful with the use of persuasive narratives and frames to persuade investors in particular to divest from companies. So shaming investors or promoting investors that use socially responsible approaches. And we've seen that very successful persuasive narrative helping to divest hundreds of billions of dollars from tobacco and increasingly from fossil fuel and firearms industries. And then this use of strategic action, and particularly litigation, so the use of law as a powerful civil society tool. So public health litigation we've seen can win compensation for victims of corporate harm. It can deter future wrongdoing and change the sort of the norms towards industry. We've seen that with opioid manufacturers, tobacco companies, pesticide producers, and we're currently seeing that with tobacco litigation. And it's all of this coming together of approaches by civil society organisations creating and pushing opening doors with that shared vision that's vitally important. So really, paper 3 is about a call to action, remembering that there is no one silver bullet. What paper 3 outlines is the model mongering that is essential, with recognising the many different governors of the commercial determinants of health at multiple levels. Governments and international organisations must use their structural power to change policy systems and incentivise investment in business models that are essential for health equity and sustainability. Commercial actors just have to stop opposing health regulatory policies, full stop. They've got to respect regulations to reduce harmful practices and products, and they must implement regenerative business models. Civil society, get noisy, raise our collective voices, articulate these alternative visions, and hold commercial actors and governments to account. Wouldn't it just be fantastic if civil society was properly funded and if it was never, ever gagged? Researchers, of course, play an important role. We must provide evidence that is fit for purpose. It must be presented in the right way at the right time to the right audiences. Let's get strategic with our evidence. And then finally, health actors we have to break with the hegemony of a biomedical model of health and get out there, be at those policy decision-making tables with the finance people, with the trade people, with the social welfare people, etc., engaging very, very properly. Because as Rob reminded us at the beginning, the most basic public health question for us today, which we say in paper 3, is not whether the world has the resources or the will to take these actions, these types of actions that I've described and that we've described in paper 3, but whether humanity can survive if we fail to make the effort. So this is a call to action. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sharon, for that wonderful presentation and bringing out a whole lot of issues around what we can possibly do with answer some of the brilliant questions that are actually there. I now want to introduce Paula Johns, who's the Executive Director of ACT Health Promotion in Brazil. Over to you, Paula.
Hi, hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. I'm talking from Brazil. It's a pleasure to be talking about the importance of the series for civil society organizations. We are a coalition, so nice to speak after Sharon and where she already mentioned like the coalition building and importance of that for moving with policies. So we work on health promotion and based mostly on the risk factors around non-communicable diseases. We start with tobacco control, which is a very successful case story of what advocacy means. We are advocates, so we push for policies based on the best available evidence. And so we really do need the work from researchers and from academia. And we push politicians to do what they need to do, right? To make sure that we have like the environments are healthier for people to be able to make healthier choices. And I think this is an example that shows how successful we can be if we adopt the right policies. And we like to say that, well, advocacy is the art of turning the impossible made possible. And this is our... So beginning to talk about the importance of this series, I think it's wonderful that we recognize the problem. We need to talk about the elephant in the room. I think we have done that successfully with tobacco, and I don't think we have done it enough for the other risk factors or for other commercial actors and the impact on health. So I think this series is it's an excellent tool that we'll have. Here I brought an example of like what we are doing some monitoring around big food, and I think alcohol, it's a completely neglected child in the field of non-communicable diseases. There is like, including when you have like, if we think about the structures, when you think about all the restrictions, for example, WHO has with regards to tobacco and arms, and like the conversations around alcohol and big food are not the same, like ultra processed food industries, and I think we need to move in that direction as well. It's not a new problem. I brought an old quote with purpose, like from 10 years ago, and I was really happy to read Dr. Tedder's commentary to this series now, because that recognition that it's not only tobacco anymore, that public health also needs to deal with big food, big soda, and big alcohol. All these industries fear regulation, and they do protect themselves by using the same tactics. We have seen that in the former presents. I mean, the model shows it very well, how those practices unfold themselves. And when industry is involved in policy making, rest assured that the most effective control measures will be downplayed or left out. And as an advocate, I mean, this is our daily reality. If we were able, I mean, we could have adopted like really effective policies for decades ago if it were not for the industry opposition with regards to the effective policies. That's also valid for tobacco. Even though we have advanced, it took like much longer than from the moment the evidence was available. So it's kind of, we are living, I think, in the world today, how it's set up, like we need to regulate the corporations, but I like that. I think it shows very well where the problem lies, because I mean, the corporations own the government, they need to be regulated by whom? By the government. I think so we need to break this loop, and like civil society has an important role to play there. It's not, I mean, maybe it sounds very simple, but I know the complexity around it, but even if like we want for most of the basic policies, we are not even able to advance with some of the most basic policies because of industry opposition. There was a more or less recent quote, because it's so relevant still, from like a pre-summit on the UN Summit on Food System that happened in July 2021, in which there was this sentence, there was a wonderful speech. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend, from Jeffrey Sachs. This recognition that while the private sector is not going to solve this problem unless we have better governance, right? Unless we are able like to make the externalities be part of the final price, for example, of harmful products. But I mean, the basic ask as it is right now, it's like really simple. Please behave, pay your taxes, and follow the rules. We have also seen in the model that you have like from legal to the illegal, but you have also all the unethical practices. And then, for example, just to give a very quick example of what's going on in Brazil now. Brazil, it's a large exporter of like commodities like soya and sugar. And here we see an example that like the soda prices are going down and the sugar prices are going down and the food prices are going up. I mean, the image is not very good, but I mean, if you look at like the area in which we are using to plant, like, for example, soy, sugar, and corn, are growing, and the area that we are using to produce real food are really going down. It's the line under them. So that's a big, I mean, that's an example of where are we investing? Like, even because here we're also talking about heavy subsidies from the government to produce these commodities that are filling in like the ultra processed food industry, and you have again this loop that we need to break. So to sum up, like how I think it's very helpful, it's a valuable tool to help minimize the power asymmetries in policymaking process. It helps us understanding why some indicators are simply not improving. I think Richard Norton brought a good example, or are so modest. Why have you not adopted really effective policies around non-communicable diseases? We know what they are, but we are not really doing that on a global scale. There is not one single country that have adopted the best buys around NCDs. And I think it will be very helpful to overcome the regulatory barriers around NCD risk factors. And it's the systemic approach that explain and expose the structural drivers of the challenge that we have ahead of us. And I think it's a very good tool to leverage our active hope to lobby for healthier environments and to achieve the SDGs, leaving no one behind. In other words, we need to walk the talk. And then I'll refer back to like the imagine scenarios that Sharon put ahead of us. Like for the future, I really hope, I want to be able to say in this life that all corporations, based on lived experience, not on like this corporate discourse narrative that all greenwashing or health washing style, but that they really become part of the solution to overcome our common health and planetary challenges, that they stop, that we are able to stop the commercial actors' opposition to health regulation and policies. And I really hope for a world in which human and planetary health are prioritized over profits. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Paolo. It's really fascinating. And now I'd like to call on Lucy Mugai, who's the CEO of B-Lab Africa. Lucy, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. So in the 20th century, we observed shareholder capitalism, a focus on what is good for shareholder and the business, and a focus solely on the maximization of profit for shareholders only. But now we've seen a global shift where we see the importance of all stakeholders and the effects of sidelining them. We're experiencing a cultural shift to harness the power of business to help address society's greatest challenges. Businesses are taking the stand to become regenerative, inclusive, and for the benefit of multiple stakeholders. So B-Lab is redefining business success as not for profit, but for purpose. We have created standards, policies, and tools for businesses, and we certify companies known as B Corps who are leading the way. The global network powers the B Corp movement at the local level. We have global partners in Asia, Australia and New Zealand, Europe, UK, Latin America, US and Canada, and now Africa, where I am located. So B-Lab's approach to systemic change to a more inclusive and regenerative planet is where we start with a community of demonstrated leaders who are meeting the highest standards of social and environmental performance. These are the ones that we call B Corps, certified B corporations, right? And then one of the things we recognize is that not every organization is making the way, working to become a B Corp, yes? But every company can work towards being a more impactful and sustainable business. This is through using the tools that B-Lab has been able to create to make it easy for millions of other businesses to follow suit. We finally inspire billions of consumers, investors also to invest in these businesses, and support these businesses by buying from them, investing in them, so that these businesses are a force for good. And at the end, we'll be able to share a durable prosperity for all. So B-Lab certifies all types of businesses, irrespective of their sector, size, and location. So globally, we have over 6,500 certified B Corps in 161 industries, 89 countries across the world, with one unifying goal of using business as a force for good. B-Lab Africa was founded in 2017, and we currently have almost 60 B Corps, and as you can see, in various types of industries from the slide. Most of our B Corps are currently in East Africa, but we are also getting a lot of traction from companies in other parts of Africa. This slideshow is a visual of the B Corps we have in Africa. We currently have a mix of small to large businesses. So here we're diving deeper to some of our B Corps that are creating a lot of impact. I wanted to highlight 4 or 5. We have Mr. Green Africa, that are a recycling company that collects, converts, and sells post-consumer plastic waste. We have Faithful to Nature, that is based in South Africa, an online health and well-being retailer that gives shoppers access to honest and ethical products. We have We Light Madagascar, that's based in Madagascar, one of our B Corps that operates solar and hydro mini grids in rural areas. And we have COA based in Ghana that works directly with cocoa farmers to process cocoa fruits. So through their innovation, they're able to reduce food waste and increase the income of cocoa smallholders significantly. And as a result, COA brings impactful cocoa products to the whole of the world. So as I mentioned, certified B Corps, B-Lab certifies B Corps all over the world and whichever industry. So one of the things I thought would be great is to highlight some of our B Corps in the health industry across the world. Again, as I mentioned, we certify businesses across any industry, yes? And so these will be good companies to be able to highlight. We have America's Health based in Brazil, Monashi Health Collective in Canada, Healthic in Mexico, and Simsol Healthcare in the States, just to mention a few. So one of the things I wanted to highlight is that we, as B-Lab, we are already integrating health in our B Corps. And this is through using our tool, the B Impact Assessment. So businesses, not only B Corps, are able to evaluate their company's contribution to their employees' health, wellness, and safety. And this is just by looking at, are you providing proper health care for your employees and family? Examples also of, are you providing leave as needed? We're looking at, annual leave, sick leave, mental health leave, maternity and paternity leave. So you're able to use our tools to be able to see where are you currently stuck up in terms of your operations and how are you able to improve from there. The company is also able to evaluate their environmental management practices, as well as its impact on the air, climate, water, land, and biodiversity. And examples are, how is this company getting rid of their waste, especially if it's hazardous? Are these businesses also managing their greenhouse gas emissions, right? So the whole idea of using our tools is looking at where are you currently at in terms of practices, and how are you able to improve from where you currently are to now in terms of having better practices as an organization. Health has also been integrated in ESG, looking at the environmental bit of ESG, where businesses will be asked to, how, again, same questions, how is a company managing their carbon emissions? And again, obviously leading to how would their impact be on climate change based on that? How is a company managing their waste, right? Is it causing any air and water pollution? So the whole idea is those questions are already covered in the E of the ESG. Looking at the social for ESG, the social bit of ESG, here we're looking at things concerning employee engagement. And back to the questions that we're able to look at from our assessment too, where is, are you taking care of your employee in terms of from a health perspective, right? Are we giving them good health cover? Are we giving them leave? Are we making sure that we're not overworking them? Because again, as we know, our employees are our biggest asset. Right? So it's a matter of making sure as we pay them well, we are also making sure that they're having work-life integration so that these people are actually healthy holistically. And then the other thing that we look at also on the social perspective is the labor standards and policies. Are we following them in terms of just from a leave perspective? Are we giving them that time to take off, to be able to rejuvenate and then come back and give their all best self to the organization, right? But with that said, there's definitely more that we can do as businesses. And one of the things that I think would be very big that I believe my colleague Sharon mentioned is increased collaboration between companies or businesses, governments, and the civil society to be able to address, these complex health challenges and environmental health risks that we're seeing in society, right, all over the world, right? So that would be the biggest, I'd say the biggest, contributor that would take place, because as much as we work with businesses, we do know that private sector cannot solve all the issues, right? Everyone in the ecosystem definitely needs to take a place. Academia has to, in terms of this research that has been able to take place. Private sector also has to play a part. Government has to, and also as Paula has mentioned, civil society also has to take a part. So everybody must come together to be able to solve these issues that we're seeing in the health sector, in society at large. So my final call to action is, as I mentioned earlier, we certify companies as B Corps. And these are businesses that we are shining a light on, that they are profitable, but they're also creating a high social and environmental impact. And again, as I had mentioned earlier, that not every company is yet to become a certified B Corp. But that doesn't mean that a company or a business cannot work towards being a sustainable or impactful business. And what we have done is we have actually created tools. And my call to action here is take the impact assessment. The assessment tool is free, right? So all that a company needs to do is to create an account for them. And from there on, you're able to now assess what impact is your business currently having, and how can you improve from where you are at to where you'd want to be. And the best thing about this, the tool, is that you get access to best practice guides. It is a very collaborative tool that you'll be able to include your team members. Yeah, you can also download it in case you want to work offline and be able to upload your results later, right? But again, as I said, use the tool to be able to measure your sustainability and impact and see where you need to improve on, because we can only manage what we measure. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lucy. Thank you so much, Lucy, and to all of the authors and the panelists. That was exactly the right end for all of those presentations, how we can take this series into discussions with other sectors. So to the audience, thank you so much for all of these amazing questions which we have in front of us. There are many and they're all excellent. We are probably only going to be able to take one or two, unfortunately, because of timing, according to our Lancet producers. So I am going to start with Florence, number and I'm going to ask this to Anna, if you had to choose 3 strategic paths or actions to resolve the issues you presented, which ones would you choose? And Anna, if you can just keep it to like 2 minutes, then we can maybe keep rolling with some other questions.
Florence, I think that's an incredibly important question because there is so much that we could do and we need to focus. So I would highlight, I think, probably 4 things. And I do this by really, looking at the model. So we need to change macroeconomic policies. We need to move away from the focus on GDP, from the outside there. I think we need to address the drivers, and that's by addressing externalities. And then we need to make sure, in the words of Jeffrey Sachs, actually, I think that sums it up really nicely, that corporations behave. And ultimately, to deliver all of that, we simply need governments to act in the public interest, and that really should not be too much to ask. So that's what I would have as my 4 sort of key issues, but others may have other ideas.
That was really concise and excellent, Anna. Thank you so much. The next question I'd like to ask is to Rob from Prosper. The determination of business models and forms of investment is normally handled at high levels at government, at global levels. How do we ensure that the beneficiaries, and especially the low-income countries, get to have space at the table where these decisions are being made?
Thanks. I mean, the point, I guess, about this is that, and we've seen this a lot in global health, and we've seen it through the epidemic as well, is that simply many countries, and particularly low and middle income countries, are left off really away from the table, both in terms of international governance and obviously in all the fora that we're talking about. And frankly, we just need to make these much more responsive and much more egalitarian in terms of who actually gets a voice. As we know, even we're talking about WHO, we're talking about, and I've worked with organisations like UNAIDS. Then often it's those who pay the piper they get the tune, they play the tune, and this really has to change. So there's a much more equal sense of who's at the table. If I could just add also, I think one of the big issues that we've started to think about in terms of how do we shift the power balance is actually the notion of investors, and really starting to look at it, the way that investors actually impact on corporations impact on retailers. And in many ways, I think there's starting to come some new approaches about not only disinvestment, but also actually really convincing long-term investors they want to get a return on their long-term investment. Then they really do need to have a much healthier approach to the products and the processes they use.
Thanks very much, Rob. Next, a question for Sharon from Tara. Appreciating the policies framework overall vision that you present, is there really a world in which health can be compatible with some of the bigger perpetrators, fossil fuel, alcohol, tobacco companies? How can they ever be trusted and positive partners for healthy futures? Surely they're gone too far for redemption. I'll let you take that one.
No, it's a great point. And I think we're very clear that we don't have any interaction with the tobacco industry. For example, we have very clear guidance around those conflicts of interest. And I think we're increasingly seeing that with fossil fuels as well, that the goals are sort of diametrically opposed in some regards. I think there are possibilities when we start to, I think Anna was raising again the importance of macroeconomic policy. So if you think of when we're sitting around the table in relation to trade policy, for example, where the interests of some of these big corporations are being presented in trade negotiations. But trade negotiators that's public policy, that is government policy. And so they do have to consider their the balance of interests in there. I think that's a possibility as a way to really try and disentangle some of the companies and their practices that we just do not have any alignment with versus what some of the big macroeconomic policy that is government policy that can help mediate some of the harms.
Thanks very much, Sharon. Finally, a couple more. Grant to Jen. Thinking about key sets of questions for assessing corporations, should this also include how if they engage powerful consultancy groups, which so often set the trajectory for transforming corporations for better or worse? Jen, could you take that?
The short answer is yes. The slightly longer answer would be, I think we could look both at the consulting organizations as commercial entities in their own right, of course, and analyzing the practices that they engage with. But I think this also points to perhaps one of the very practical challenges of this framework, which is that all of these commercial actors are going to have networks and connections with all of these other ones, whether it's through their supply chains or whether it's through the bank that audits them or whether it's through the consulting firm that audits them or that holds their money. And so teasing out those networks and figuring out where you draw a boundary around that and how many layers deep you go in terms of managing conflicts of interest or thinking this through, I think will be a really interesting and practical challenges when we try to do this. So yes, we should do this, but where we draw the line down that step, I think will be a question that needs to be explored further.
Thanks very much, Jen. Odilon, for maybe Paula, Lucy, Rob, whichever one of you want to take this one. Wouldn't the sorts of changes you're proposing require fundamental change in political systems? Campaign financing and lobbying rules would need to be changed, but there seems to be zero political momentum to achieve this. Are incremental changes enough?
Okay, I'll take this first. Well, that's a good question. I think we need, I think some of the questions also talked about like the urgency of some of the changes that need to happen now, right? Not only around health, but the climate crisis. So I think we do need to have some changes at the global level, at the global macro level in terms of what we are allowing for. Even like if you think about investors groups and the concentration of power also in that area, even like shareholders activism, it's not enough anymore in today's world because most of the shares are held by like big investors groups. So I think we need both. I think we do need incremental change in the policies that we have, like the evidence for adopting them, and I think we are gaining momentum for that. By recognizing the problem, I think this is a big thing that we are, although it's not new, I think there is a different level of recognition of the problem. And I think that's good. I think that's an important thing to be able to move in the next step. But I think at the same time, we do need more like macro global level changes so that we are able like to meet somewhere and kind of like stop the crisis we are at the moment. I hope I answered. Thank you, Rob.
Yeah, just one thing I think we take away from this wonderful discussion and the wonderful questions is this notion of everybody here could work out a new partner or 3 new partners they want to work with over the next year. Someone's mentioned about how we need to work across the different risk factors or different products. But the point is also we need to work, as Sharon's pointed out, at different levels as well. So actually thinking about how every one of us can actually work with 3 new partners or 4 new partners or whatever, and work out how we can make these networks work. Then I think that really makes us stronger, and it gives us a lot more optimism about this whole issue as well.
Thanks very much. Next one, Joe. To what extent do the panel believe that CSR of harmful commodity producers are greenwashing versus positive change? How should non-commercial actors respond to this type of action? Should it be welcomed or challenged? I don't know who wants to take that. Perhaps Sharon and Lucy can respond in part.
Do you want me to kick off with it?
Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah, I think it sort of highlights the real challenge that we have, and the sort of various questions in the chat have been sort of pointing towards how some corporations, companies kind of capture the agenda, and of course the potential for greenwashing and health washing is one of the ways of doing, or corporate social responsibility is one of the ways of doing that. So one, calling that out is vitally important. And two, the suggestion that actually the money that gets spent on corporate social responsibility for doing the greenwashing or the health washing, wouldn't it be fantastic if they sort of paid that in their taxes or provided. So there's a double edge, call it out and actually call for the systems that could make use of their money in better ways.
Maybe Anna?
Yes, I mean, I think the evidence here is quite clear that so for some industries that benign industries, CSR and ESG has led to some benefits, but for unhealthy commodity industries, really the evidence is that it has not. And actually, we should really see it as a form, a tax deductible form of marketing and policy influence. And really, when used by those industries, it's incredibly pernicious. And actually, I think we should regulate it in the way that we regulate marketing. And the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control suggests that. And what's key, I think, about these, we call them reputation management initiatives in this paper, because they enable all the other practices. So I think of reputation management or CSR as oiling the wheels, if you like, of other practices, because for corporations who have an image problem, whose products are detrimental to health, it's becoming increasingly hard for them to knock on the doors of policymakers. And that's exactly why they invest in these reputation management initiatives, to make that easier. So when you start to dissect political practices, reputation management is a core part of political practices. It's also a core part of scientific practices, because it's opening the door to scientists. And that's why in our model we have it right at the centre, because it enables all those other practices which can be equally problematic. So I think it is greenwashing and whitewashing when done by those by unhealthy commodity industries.
Thank you so much. I think that's about all the questions we can take today. I hope that you appear at some of the other city launches and ask more questions to the authorship team. But firstly, thank you and congratulations to Rob, Anna, Sharon and Jen and your 16 author teams around the world for producing such a fantastic, inspiring series for us. It's been a real pleasure to work with you over these years. Thank you to Paula and Lucy for making time for this work on the panel. And we look forward to working with you in the future to advance this field. Thank you to Vic Health and all the sponsors of this series. And in particular, I want to thank the Lancet team, fantastic Lancet team in London, who are always behind the scenes getting everything ready. Finally, thank you to you, the audience, for your interest and with whom we hope we'll continue to do discussions and advocacy around the world. Stay tuned, follow our authors, follow the Lancet. And from now in Melbourne, I bid you good night and thank you for your time.
Thank you.